Thank you, everyone who came out tonight, and I want to thank, my name is Jason Gotts, and I want to thank St. Francis College and BookCourt for making this possible. Saying that somebody needs no introduction is generally a prelude to a very long-winded introduction, but I don't think I can tell you anything about Mary-Louise Parker or Elvis Costello that you probably don't already know, but you know, the host's duties are what they are. So. For multiple decades, Elvis Costello has been one of our most influential songwriters and lyricists in pop and rock music. He has won Grammy Awards for his music and has been inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Mary-Louise Parker is one of our finest working actresses, best known perhaps for roles in the film version of Angels in America and Showtime's Weeds. But the reason that we're here tonight is that both of them, extraordinarily accomplished artists in their separate fields of music and acting, have written wonderful books about their lives that are extremely different in form and tone. Elvis Costello's Unfaithful Music Disappearing Ink is a comprehensive and funny and ironic, you know, very much in the voice in the voice you might recognize from his lyrics, recounting of Elvis's life, his childhood in Liverpool, his coming into his own as an artist, the vagaries of fame, and his relationship with his father. And Mary-Louise Parker's book, Dear Mr. You, is a series of conversations with real and, letters basically to real and hypothetical men, past, present, and future in her life. It's poetic and beautiful and wonderful. So I hope you're as excited as I am to be welcoming Mary-Louise Parker and Elvis Costello to the stage tonight. So I have a series of questions for you guys. Some are for both of you, but you know, obviously your books are very different. Are you? Sorry?
I'm not being enigmatic wearing sunglasses inside on that light.
Yeah. Would you bet? You want to switch seats?
No, that's fine.
We can turn off the lights.
That would be cooler. All right. So I have a series of questions for both of you, which you can. Nice. Really nice.
I'm still keeping them on anyway.
And you're Elvis Costello.
And then a few for each of you individually. I want to start by saying that it seems to me that when you're writing about your life, you find yourself. I mean, I've written about my life. I haven't written a book. You know, you guys both have written wonderful ones. You're wrestling with what you might call the greased pig of memory. Memory is unreliable. Like when things happened, what happened, who was there, and what it all meant. So I guess I wanted to ask you both, you know, separately to maybe comment on how you chose to do that. What difficulties you encountered in going back into these memories, and the decisions that you made along the way about how to write about them. Maybe we start with Mary-Louise and go to Elvis.
Well, that is a very good question. I would say that because the point of my book, in a way, was, it was first of all kind of foreign about my father, but it was really about gratitude as well, and it's just, to me, ultimately a bunch of thank you notes. So, for instance, like with, there's a letter, Dear Cab Driver, and I suppose I could have written, you know, that letter 6 different ways, and they would have all been true. But I wanted to tell it as best I could from his point of view. I wanted to tell his story and why he haunts me, and what it was about him, and how I failed in that encounter, and how I rebounded from that encounter. So, and I feel like I was really trying to not spare myself, which is something that I think Elvis does really brilliantly in his book is he's so unsparing with himself, and so if he's hard on anyone, it's Elvis Costello, which is really kind of amazing. But I aspire to do what I think his book does.
Right, and yours is a little different in that it's semi-fictional in some way. I mean, you're right. You're in conversations.
I don't know any dogs with 3 heads.
right.
I sort of do, actually.
Right. Yeah. So Elvis, like, how did you? What decisions did you make along the way in terms of?
Well, it's very interesting to read Mary-Louise's book and see the decisions that a writer could make to place the story, the pieces of your life that are important to you, the replies to questions you may have posed for yourself after events, the apologies, the accusations that you maybe didn't make at the time. In the form of these letters, it didn't read at all like fiction to me. It read very truthful, and it made me more aware, if I thought about my book at all, which I never do, that I more aware of the curious, very personal nature of structure. Having made a decision to take, you could have written a conventional biography out of these events, which would have been compelling given your facility to summon up the scene. For myself, obviously, I think we both, in a way, wrote about our fathers or a thread.
Yeah.
I sat with my mother a couple of weeks ago on her 89th birthday and I sat with her for about an hour and alone after my boys went out from her birthday party, and told her how much I loved her and how much I hadn't been a good enough writer to write down what I felt about her, in the same way as I'm not a good enough songwriter to write about my wife and how I love her. I wrote about my father because our time together was incredibly brief, but the impact of that time and the examples that he gave me, I find reason to think of them nightly when I play a certain type of show. And obviously when I wrote this book, I found the thread of the experiences. I love it when there are bottles rolling in the aisle. My favorite sound. And reading Mary-Louise's book, it reminded me that when I wrote the book, it had a very acute, almost to me, very vivid structure, and you have to commit to something and stick with it. When my editor came to me and said, "Why don't you move this chapter because it will make more chronological sense?"
Right.
I said, "Okay, I'll consider it, because there's no point in having people to advise you unless you do that." And then a week later he said, "Now I know why you had that chapter where it was, because it wasn't about chronology, and you could have put what I loved about Mary-Louise's book is that you could have put all of these events in a completely factual sequence, and you perhaps would have got a less compelling book." And I hope that if there's any use at all to having written a book of such a scale as mine, I never anticipated anybody would read it. Certainly not in a couple of weeks or days even, So that's strange to me that anybody would spend this amount of time. It's been hard enough to live this life without actually anybody else having to live it too,
Well, that kind of takes me off script, because you're both getting at something I did want to ask about, which is that your books are very different. You Elvis mentioned that Mary-Louise and Mary-Louise, you said that you're trying to get inside these relationships and trying to in a sense, you're asking for forgiveness in some ways in this, and but you do it in a way. You're very sparing and you're very careful in what you choose to include. There's a lot of space. It's very poetic and it's very spare. And Elvis, you seem to have gone the other direction. Yeah, no. But again, I wonder if that's the same impulse to try to get, to try to get it all down, to say the thing that wasn't said in one way or another.
Some of the parts, sorry, I'm just going to answer for you, but one of the parts and some of the things about his book that struck me I mean, the hardest were the parts where he did become so economical, and I think that's because he is a true storyteller. His songs do that as well, and he has the confidence of a true storyteller because he's so thorough. Like when he talks about Solomon Burke, it's like you feel like you're there, and you're like with him standing backstage throughout that entire thing. And then yet when he talks about in the beginning that very moving passage about the boy and the way the meter and the rhythm of the writing slows down, and he says, "No one spoke. There was no blood, a siren wailed." It's amazing what about that passage he didn't write. He didn't go on and on about what happened, and it kind of, I think it's because of that it kind of takes you. So I feel like he knew when to go into the minutia and when to put air around it.
I guess what I'm saying is that it seemed to me reading both of your books that when you're trying to write about your life in the very different ways that you did, that you're trying to, make sure that things don't go unsaid, whether they're things that weren't said at the time in your case, or whether it's things that you're trying to get down because you want to articulate them so that they're there, so that they have been said. Because your lyric writing, Elvis, is a very different thing from this book. It's a very different craft.
I don't know about that. I don't agree with that.
No?
No. I could have made 5 albums out of the lines in this book, probably, if I'd been more ruthless. But then again, I could have made a much more commercial book if I had wanted to name names and make an accounting and describe things in a lurid detail that would be unbecoming for a man of my years. I disagree with you entirely about what you said about Mary-Louise Parker. Poetic, yeah, but it's so unstinting both in its praise of people and in its intimacy. Both emotional, physical. There's no fade to black stuff like in my book. I mean, like I say, I just chose not to do that because it's kind of ludicrous in men. My feeling. I mean, I find it very ludicrous. I found. Like Keith Richards, whose book I really love, I don't really care whether he has a bigger dick than Mick Jagger. I actually don't care. I do care. I do care, because you know what? That doesn't make it Satisfaction a better record. But listening to Howlin' Wolf records alone in the dark, tuned in on Radio Luxembourg when you couldn't hear them any other way, that made the Rolling Stones great. That the fact that language, that secret language that they alone interpreted in that particular way from these records that were made in Chicago or Mississippi or wherever they were made, that's what made that music great. The other stuff is just stuff the editor probably put in later, because he knew it would fucking sell copies of the Daily Mail. Really? Because that's the kind of salacious stuff that English people like because they are afraid of sex, Can you imagine how ludicrous it would be if you actually published that book exclusively in France, how much they would laugh at you, Because, there's different cultures where they have a different attitude to where the taboo is. And there's some places where you would be literally stoned to death for writing either of these books. Ours not, and that doesn't make us in any way heroic. It's just we have the freedom to write one way or another.
Sure.
And there's other places, where people are very prudish about any reference to. You can be prudish about emotions, not just physical acts,
Right.
So I think that, we've got a lot of choices of how to say things. For myself, there's a lot of wasted words, obviously, and murdered trees to make my book. I'm glad I've got it all down there, because one day, when I can't remember any of it, I'll be glad that somebody can read it to me. Like, hopefully, somebody kind and wearing a nice nurse's uniform, reading soup,
I want to go back into the thing, the dads loom large in both of your books.
Fathers died in the same year, too, which is interesting.
So, obviously each of you, your relationships with your dads are very different. Your dads are very different people, but if you could separately address what it was like to discuss that relationship and get into it in writing, and whether it changed anything in terms of how you thought about that relationship, or what you learned from it in the process.
I don't know what I learned. I would say that my relationship with my father is a conversation that will never be finished, and is a moment that will never end as long as I am. And I just wanted to be truthful to him. And, you know, summoning him and conjuring all of that, I've always written, you know, and I save cocktail napkins and receipts and bits of paper and half-filled journals, and I have stacks and stacks of paper, and there was so much in my book was remembered because I have a really great memory for things that people say in moments, but a horrible memory for things like who's the vice president and things like that. Where's my phone? But I did get to go back over pieces of paper and just lifting up those pieces of paper and remembering when my pencil touched that paper and how I felt, you know, right after he died, and why I chose that word, or where I was in this part of my relationship with my father, who's no longer with us. I felt like I had him back for a little moment when I was writing it, and that was nice. And I don't read it ever, but I think it's because I'm saving it, so that if I really want to, I feel like if I read it, I can maybe have him out just for a second, you know?
Elvis, did you want to speak to this?
Well, it's curious, you know, with a decision, or when you have a central character, if there is one, it isn't necessarily yourself. I mean, a lot of people took out of reading my book that it was about my father. I don't think he's in it that much, but I mean, there's a decision that I made, was that I wrote about his death, and there was quite a considerable amount of the book still. I mean, if I'd been thinking cynically, I would have made it a dramatic end, and this was the moment, and then I didn't explain anything after that. What I loved about Mary-Louise was so full of humor as well as revelation, and some anger, and a lot of regret, and some, as you say, poetic musing on things that are really beyond words. And even the framing of the chapter about your father's death it's not just about his passing, it's actually about his reconciliation with his nature. It's so condensed. It's a whole book's worth. Many people have written that book about the struggle of the child to reconcile themselves to the revelations of adulthood, of their adulthood, of their true nature of a parent. Many people have come to terms with that. Many people walk every day in the shadow of the cruelty of a parent, or the absence of a parent. And the beauty of the last chapter, was to pick a chapter, is to having framed the thanks for his Last Supper to the person responsible for providing the fare, was a really gracious decision. And I mean, this again is something you can't plot out when you're writing the nature of the book I wrote. I just let these experiences in the company of my father. I was a witness to his career when I was young. He was a witness to mine. Then I was a witness to his leaving the earth, and the music that attended him and me was two separate tunes. But that's really what the book is. My book is really not about my father, it's about music.
Right.
It's about music, about the solace in music, and the guidance of music, and sacramental nature of music. And the names of people, and the amusing things that happen, most of them ridiculous. I would hope people by now are clever enough to realize that fame is a trap and a mirage, and they don't really need me to explain that to them, but I'm happy to make myself the fool in those stories, because what choice do I have? This is the face I was born with, you know.
I wanted to ask you, Elvis, about the title, which is deceptively simple, but maybe you could, or not even that simple. Unfaithful Music and Disappearing Ink. I think I wondered if you could speak to how you ended up with that, or how you chose that.
I felt that I've always liked paradoxical titles, and obviously, I would think anybody that read it for 5 minutes or watched anything I did for 5 minutes would know that music has not been an unfaithful. I've been unfaithful to music. I've been unfaithful to love. I've been unfaithful. That it's a criticism of myself, and it's a shadow that I live with. That memory is not permanent. That's an experience in my family. So I just chose that. Like I once called a record "Get Happy" when I was not particularly happy. And I one called "Trust" when I was not particularly trustworthy.
I had one thing that I thought was really surprising about your book was you talk about this, you're at the American Music Awards, and it's a really not a fun experience for you. And you detailed it in such a way about there's this young girl in the audience who's clearly not enjoying your performance, and all of us who've performed on stage know what that's like, to feel like there is this person and it's almost like they have a spotlight on them, and they're staring. Victor Garber said it's like waves of hate are wafting over you, and like unsettling you and like turning your bones to marrow, and you really feel like that person just wants to kill you with their eyes. And I thought it's so astonishing, because I've never seen an artist or a musician write about that, especially a musician. And to me, I think
Donald Fagen.
Who would not be at an Elvis Costello concert and excited?
Did you read Donald Fagen's book? Donald writes chapter after chapter about that stuff. It's like
people staring daggers at him?
Him staring daggers and shouting abuse at people in the audience. And I loved the book. I thought, oh my goodness, he's written the book I was trying to write. But of course, I love everybody except that little girl there that was giving me the hateful stare. Little pinch-faced Satan that she was. No, I mean, that would be listen, if you had the choice between looking at me or looking at Justin Timberlake, who wouldn't choose Justin, But it was just, it's one of a number of really curious, where you find yourself in the wrong, you must have surely found yourself in the wrong circumstances once in a while. I mean, I don't think I've ever heard a male musician really sort of detail that experience in the way that was so, it was the way when you were talking about, you said, I learned to walk on the sides of my feet. In a sense, the description of that and the way that they'd taken you to a doctor to teach you how to walk, that could have been a song itself. I felt like that was almost written. It's curious. I mean, I think there's just a difference in the English and American sensitivities, just like I said, about prudery and revelation and even what's called art. I mean, my boys are 9 years old. They have an English drama teacher, and she said to them, she took them aside recently and said, look, I'm going to tell you, I want you to be in the school production, but I don't want you to kick each other in the balls like you usually do. I just can't imagine an American teacher getting away with saying that. That she, in Brooklyn they might. Yeah, I think it would be hauled away if he said. And similarly, when I, was put through this weird medieval torture where they discovered I had flat feet, I should have been grateful. I can never be in the army. But they did. And now they would obviously find a more scientific way of devising a way to raise your arches in some way. But in those days, they just used to put your feet in bowls of electrified water and make you walk on the side of your feet like a monkey, But yeah. Not very long before that, they used to put people in cages and poke them with sticks in England. So, I mean, actually now they do that. But, I mean, it's like...
So what is this difference that you're getting at between... Because I always thought of the difference being that the English were more reserved, and you're making them sound a lot less so.
Are you kidding?
Well, it's what they're reserving.
No, they're only,
what they're holding reserve.
They're only reserved, maybe, but I think they're only reserved in the American movie version. Like they're not all like David Niven,
So All right, so Mary-Louise, you were on our podcast, and before we recorded, I kind of wish we had that on tape. We had a conversation about poetry, which you love, and you recommended a bunch of poets to me who I went on and read. And one of them, one poem in particular about John Murillo, connects to your book in a way. I am going somewhere with this. I wonder if you would mind just kind of reading the beginning of this. This is upon, yes, reading that Eric Dolphy transcribed even the calls of certain species of birds.
Which part?
I know it's rather long, but this is a small excerpt of a very long poem. Do you mind reading that? Is that too long?
You may all go to sleep. I don't care.
And well, we're going to talk about it. It
What?
connects to your
I
book.
can't stand it. This is the title. Upon reading that Eric Dolphy transcribed even the calls of certain species of birds, by John Murillo. I think first of two sparrows I met when walking home, late night years ago in another city, not unlike this. The one bird frantic, attacking, I thought, the way she swooped down, circled my head and flailed her wings in my face. How she seemed to scream each time I swung. How she dashed back and forth between me and a blood-red Corolla parked near the opposite curb. How finally I understood. I spied another bird also calling, its foot inexplicably caught in the car's closed door, beating its whole bird body against it. Trying, it appeared, to bang himself free, and who knows how long he'd been there, wailing. Who knows? He and the other I mistook at first for a bat. They called to me something between squawk and chirp, something between song and prayer to do something, anything, and like any good God, I disappeared. Not indifferent exactly, but with things to do, and most likely on my way home from another heartbreak.
Okay. So why am I asking Mary-Louise to read a poem by somebody else at her book conversation? There was a thing that came up for me repeatedly in reading your book, and I don't know if this is the thing Elvis was disagreeing with me on, but I want to unpack that more at some point. But like this narrator, kind of walking away in a moment when something could have been done. There were a couple of moments in your book where I felt like this was a theme of you looking back on moments where you would have liked to, that spirit, in French they call it the esprit d'escalier, like when you're on the staircase later and thinking, I wish I had whatever. I feel like that was a big motivation in a lot of cases in some of the stories you were telling here, like this kind of reaching back to a moment where, you might have said something, you might have done something differently. Do you feel that at all?
No, I mean, I think when I untangled those moments, they're perfect for me in their incompleteness, and they're perfect for me with their sort of ellipses at the end, because I think sort of like definitive punctuation is completely overrated. I don't think endings actually exist.
I feel that way about spelling.
Spelling, yeah. Uppercase, lowercase, who gives a shit? I just feel like to me, they're all one big ellipses, and I like that those moments weren't, some of them, because some of them are about moments that happened, but I like that they weren't complete. They didn't complete themselves. They were, cracked open. They weren't hatched completely. They were, they were half experienced. They were just a taste of something. They were the beginning of something. They were halfway through. They were, so it leaves you and so it leaves some kind of tension. Do you know what I mean? As opposed to some release where something's finished.
No, for sure, and that's why they work, and that's why it's powerful to read. I just feel this moral impulse in your writing, and it came across also in our conversation, to try harder to get, all the time to connect and to not miss things, not miss what other people are going through. Right. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's because we're so afraid as people, and I feel like I've always felt like, people tend to roll their eyes when you say this, but I have always felt a bit apart and a bit peripheral, outside. But if somebody is upset or unhappy or even angry, I feel like I'm the person that will go into the cage with the angry dog, not the actual dog, because I'm actually afraid of dogs, but I feel much more comfortable with people in times of crisis, even if I don't know them, than trying to converse with someone in a perfunctory way. Not because I'm so deep and because I'm so compassionate, maybe I am, but when things feel rehearsed, I get very agitated. And I feel that way on stage, I feel that way when I'm acting. When I feel like a recursive nature to like an exchange with somebody, it makes me very agitated. And I'd rather try to communicate with somebody who's in crisis than standing on the roof of wherever. I'm not as good at that, I don't think.
Gotcha. Elvis, I wanted to ask you, you spend a lot of time in your book, you go back to old songs, you write about your lyrics and how songs were written. Not just the stories behind them, but also like the process of writing them and where you were and stuff. Like in looking back at all of that music and going back through your lyrics, what are some of your thoughts about kind of what you've been trying to do all these years lyrically and where that's been heading, how that has developed? I speak as someone who's been reading and loving your lyrics and listening to them since I was like 16. So,
I didn't really write the passages about the words with the intention of either instruction manual on how to do it, or I think it was worthwhile to acknowledge the origin, the emotional origin of passages in some songs which might have been obscure to the casual listener, and might still be obscure to the casual listener. I did think at one point of drawing a line in the book and simply printing unpunctuated lyrics for about the last third of the book until it just became meaningless babble. I did write that version out around the time I took like 100,000 words out of the book,
Why?
Then I thought, well, that might just look like a provocative gesture rather than making anybody curious. So I wrote some of the lyrics that mattered to me. I don't know, or really, I can't wish for anybody caring about songs in the same way as you can from the age of 9 or 16 or 21 or 25. Things that matter to me now, I wouldn't be doing this if I didn't care about it. Certainly, there would have to be other ways to make a living than doing this, and not necessarily better ones, but certainly less unpredictable. So it seemed as good a thing to do with the words, to use them if instead, there's funny, what do they call those things? The little curlicues that they put at the end of chapters in Victorian books. I just put my lyrics there instead, so that, because the pages were all uneven length. What did I just say? Thing you said about that. Another thing I just wanted to observe about Mary-Louise's book, and maybe this will just take the conversation in a different way, is that there are obviously when we address the people people we have loved, people we have shared our lives with, people who we are related to by blood, and we change in our relationship to them as we get older. We might even become the carer of those who cared for us. There's a very beautiful chapter called Dear Abraham, where Mary-Louise describes, there's a couple of chapters in the book, a couple of the letters are addressed to people who you speak of in the apprenticeship part, and I did really find those very touching, because there's a lot of the apprenticeship in my book. I suppose well, heaven knows, the more it seemed like me, the more I would like it. No, I'm kidding. But this was beautiful, because the chapter, for those of you who haven't read the book yet, is addressed to an accountant. Is accountant? Yeah, business manager, and it describes a young woman coming in at just a total wreck, and your descriptions of yourself are very endearing. And he's going, "What? Are you all right? Are you bleeding? You know, you got cab fare? Do you need to lie down?" And little by little, you refer, I think there's a phrase, something where I go from being somebody who literally didn't have cab fare to somebody for whom a car is sent. And in that time, there's somebody whose job it is to bring some order. And of course, while we're busy being artists, or whatever the hell we think we are, there's people who have to sweep up the clippings, the fingernails you tear out, the hair you tear out, and all of the mess that you can make of it. And they are curious, and in some cases it's literally the people who keep the lights on. You know, they're not because they're paying you, but because they're making sure that you don't give all the little bit of money you're making when you get started away on foolish schemes. You know.
He was actually at my dad's funeral, and
So he's a constant.
Oh my God! He recently stopped. Well, not so recently. When he stopped working, I would sometimes, you know, because if I was in the neighborhood, I would show up at his office in Union Square, and they would tell me, the receptionist would say he was at lunch, because they were told to tell me, because they knew I'd get too upset if I knew that he wasn't working anymore, and he'd call me and act like he was still working there. And then one day when I called him and say, "Abe, you're never there anymore when I go by," and I cried so hard on the phone when he said that he actually was going to stop working. Now he was going to retire and do other things, but he would still take care of me. And he's still, like right now, he's going to take care of something for me, because I trust him in a way that I don't trust anyone else. But I just almost couldn't bear the fact that he wouldn't be there for me anymore in that way, that I thought I'm just going to go in there and take all my money and I can't stand it. It was just like so unbearable for me. I became that 22-year-old woman again who had literally no money, who fell asleep on his couch, and he took on just because he felt sorry for me or thought it was funny, or I don't know.
I felt when I had the first encounter with somebody like that, where I used to work for a bank. You know, my first job was working.
I worked for an accountant.
Yeah, I worked for a bank, both in a computer, and I worked briefly in a very Dickensian sort of branch bank, where they would be sent down into a cellar to fill in ledgers with a broken pencil. You know, and they would. And
Bartleby the Scribner?
Would come in with this thing that looked like a passport. Then you would have to fill in the pitiful amount of interest that they were being paid, and the bank was, of course, you know, screwing them out of every penny. And we you know, the whole thing was really ridiculous, because the minute when I first started out in the business, I was given £100 advance and a small battery-powered amplifier, and it seemed like an absolute fortune. And within 2 years, I had this accountant in New York who I'd come to New York on my agent, and he would take me to lunch at the Russian tea room, and I thought it was the most unbelievably luxurious thing. Neil Sedaka would be in another booth. I felt like I'd arrived in show business, you know, just walking into those sort of plush booths and everything. And I would sometimes go to his office, and he collected antique clocks, so you would try never to be there on the hour, because they all chimed at once. And he wore an orange wig, which was never exactly on the same way twice, you know. So you would go, and I felt like a child and a man at the same time, and he would come in, and the wig would be at a slightly different angle, and you couldn't help but your eyes would go up from, he would be very animated when he spoke, and you'd find yourself staring in the middle of his forehead trying to locate the wig, you know, the syrup as we call it. And eventually he came to my studio, and we were making our third record when we'd had like 2 hit records, and he closed the door and he said, "There's gonna be a war." He said, "So like buy a Rolls Royce." And he was convinced there was going to be a war, and you know, that I should put my money into real estate, or at that point a car, and I couldn't drive. I mean, it was like an entry point into sort of some kind of adulthood, because you don't, if you live on your wits, which you do if you're a songwriter or an actor, you're kind of proposing a one-of-a-kind thing if you're going to be any good at it. for better or for worse. I'm not trying to sound like other people. I can't. I have the face I have the voice I have. I could try to strive to write different, better songs. I could use different words, I could use less words, I could use more words. Of course, curly hair envies straight hair. So all my favorite songwriters are the people who can write with great economy. It isn't my gift to write with great economy, so I write, as the book proves, extensively. I find the truth in a lot of words, not in the few chosen words. But there's nothing to measure your advance as an adult other than larger face, you know, less hair, sort of whatever it is, you know, bigger guitar, you know, so the things
people
that
who faint when they meet you, like I did when I turned around and Bill Flanagan introduced me to you, and I turned around and I literally like.
No, what I'm saying, these people who care for us, they are sort of entree into
kind of
the
like that too,
adulthood.
yeah.
Adulthood is what I'm saying, some sort of adulthood that heaven knows in my business you're never supposed to have to face. You could spend your whole life, you know, the height of aspiration is to be like forever youthful. I don't want to be youthful forever. I hated being young. I like.
Don't you find they really infantilize you, like when they, you know, they show, can we get you anything? Can we, not,
Well,
you know,
that's
in
it.
certain kind of situations, and it's
After a
like,
while you say
they
yes,
don't really
you
want
can.
anything,
You
yeah.
can. I would like, you know, somebody tap dancing on that sideboard. I would like.
That actually brings me to my last question for Elvis, and then we have some audience questions, which was back in, I think, 2004, whenever you released When I Was Cruel, that album. That song, When I Was Cruel, #2, like defined my summer that summer, and that lyric. Yeah,
I'm so sorry.
I lived in a basement listening only to the but it's for those who haven't heard it, it's this incredibly beautiful, intense song that feels like kind of the experience of living your life through the lens of a paparazzi lens backstage, and there's this refrain that keeps coming up, but things were so much easier when I was cool. And there was a moment, you know, in your book, and I can't put my finger on the page or whatever, but I felt like there was an experience you were getting at, maybe about a transition from youth to adulthood there.
Yeah, I think that's pretty true. I mean, that one thing is to walk within that society is something that I would have sneered at once, and I suppose instead of which I'm sneering at myself in that song. Like for even finding myself there would be ridiculous, but inevitable. To stand outside, I mean, there's some really great artists who resist forever, but there's as much artifice to that resistance as there is to compliance. I mean, it's
Right.
it's a lot of work to be that angry for that long. Trust me on that one.
Okay. So I should get to the audience questions. Okay. For Mary-Louise, what inspired you to write this book?
I'd written for Esquire for a number of years, and there was one piece that I wrote when, generally it was, you know, we write about very male-centric things, and sometimes it was just write about men, which I thought was a little bit broad. But there was one time when I said, I think that's just too broad. I was a little bit like, I can't really do that. And my editor at the time said, just try, and no finger wagging. And I was like, who's wagging? You know, I love men. Who loves them more than me? And I was like, you know, fuck off or whatever. And I hung up. And I sat there and I literally I remember I hung up the phone and just started typing, and it came out like a letter. And I think it was called Dear You to Whom It May Concern. And it was what became the invocation for the book. And I felt like I could just keep writing it forever, because I loved that you could sort of mash up against these poetic, like, so, you know, you who carried me up the stairs, right, with that guy at the concession stand. You know, I liked the freedom of it, and I felt like I could have just written 500 pages of it. And part of, finding the names for the chapters and the people, the pseudonyms, with that part I really enjoyed. And Dear Man Out of Time, as I told you, is a nod also to Elvis. It's one of my favorite Elvis songs. And it was just, I just wanted to write a bunch of thank you notes to men. It really wasn't about, if I'd wanted to write a book about myself, I've spent a fair amount of time acting. There's not really that much about acting in the book. So it's not really a story about me per se, but I'm sort of the device.
Okay, Elvis, would you ever collaborate with McCartney again, and how is it working with him? So.
How's it working with him? He seems to be doing pretty good. No, I sort of am, in a sense, working with him again. I recently saw the package of edition of the songs that we wrote together. It's unbelievably 25 years ago. We wrote about 15 songs together. I think it was. And I worked with him on 4 songs for a record called Flowers in the Dirt, which it's come time now for them to be, reviewed. And they've made a very beautiful, very lavish package, which obviously won't be in everybody's Christmas stocking. It's a very beautiful, they really do a beautiful job. And it was wonderful to go to see you very rarely see proofs these days, printed proofs. Everything is on a computer screen, so there were actual high gloss proofs of the artwork, and they had done a wonderful job, and they included photographs I don't remember being taken. Some of me sitting at the back of the studio like this, trying to look thoughtful, trying to look like a producer while he played bass. And so I think they're going to issue in the package a whole disc of our collaborative work, which was 7 performances that were, I suppose, demos that we made immediately after writing the songs, and 6 performances with the band that were his current band, which I sort of co-produced, I suppose, or I sang on and was more featured on than certainly on the final record. So that's the answer.
Okay.
Music answer, isn't it, really, there?
Yeah, well, good answer. These are all audience questions. I got a couple more. Mary-Louise, in your book, you had a lot of detail about your family history. What did you have to work with? Pictures, diaries, how did you find the information? Thank you.
How did I find it?
That's what they're asking.
What,
Yeah.
to my closet? Like, what do you, I don't understand.
I don't know. That's what the question says.
Okay.
It's not my question.
Well, I think maybe I might have answered that already, because I do collect lots of little pieces of paper and things like that. And one of the first, I think the person who's largely responsible for the book is my my literary agent, Eric Simonoff. And I think when I was first writing, it was just sort of getting me to kind of pick a direction, because otherwise I'll just sit there for 10 years and not be able to choose, a flavor. It's like I couldn't. And I remember, he just really, there's something about him that engenders this sense of obedience in me. Like he just kind of said, I said, what about this? And he was like, I think you should do this. And I was like, okay. And I sent him a couple things. It was like, yes, that's good. And then there was one day I wrote Dear Popeye, which is the one that's a little, it's sort of not porno. It's more sexual, whatever. And I sent it to him, and he was like, yes. He was like, good. So then I just kept writing, and I was digging through things, because that was a very specific memory from a very specific day. And so I think I was looking through the journals from that time and the pieces of paper from that time, and finding, boxes of all these things that I never throw away. And I am actually quite tidy as a person, but those kinds of things I don't. I keep kind of forever. So I don't know if that answers the question, but it's mostly like boxes and journals and letters and bits of paper I had.
I have a closet full of those. I can imagine going back through them. It seems utterly terrifying.
No, it's really, really good. It's a good thing to do.
Elvis, an audience member asks, will we see any of your fiction anytime soon? There are a couple of short stories that are in your book.
They're not. This is again the choice of the form you take. I co-wrote a record which was in letter form, so I know how attractive the letter form can be, because you have certain conventions, like literally the endearments themselves can be, if you set them to music, they can really they can convey a lot of different emotions that they wouldn't if they were simply read.
If I can interrupt, I'm thinking of Famous Blue Raincoat by Leonard Cohen. That Leonard Cohen song.
Yeah, the Brodsky Quartet and I wrote this record called The Juliet Letters, which was based on the notion of people writing anonymous letters to a fictional Juliet in Verona. And I co-wrote the words with the members of the quartet. And one of the reasons that we took the form of the letter, because to some degree everybody can write a letter, but it was amazing to me, these people who had never written lyrics, they were classical musicians, they'd never written song lyrics before, because they had to write in letter form, all these memories and very personal things came tumbling out in their words, and it allowed me to let go of some of the tics and mannerisms that obviously creep into any writer's work after a while. Again, I give credit to my editor for telling me to not say "in it" in my book at the end of every, or something like that, or sort of "let me tell you," or some idiom that you use a lot, truthfully or frankly, and you don't need it. Somebody to point out how frequently you qualify yourself in that way. It doesn't actually make you more truthful to say any of those things. I've forgotten the question now. What it was like. You said no. You said
fiction.
Fiction.
They asked.
No, those were not really fictional. They were. They were in the. You said you took pseudonyms. I mean, I thought there was nothing to be gained in the description of certain scenes. There was nothing to be gained. There was greater cruelty in writing the real names of the people, unnecessary cruelty, that I felt that the thing that I was getting at in those so-called fictional sequences were not contained in identifying the people in them. I wrote a song called "And in Every Home," which was about an affair with a girl I met in a cafe in Leeds, and I was shocked when I reread the lyric, because it contained none of the truth of how bleak, not her and I were, but the world through which we passed was incredibly bleak, and I had not referred to it, and I believed I had. In my editorial head as a songwriter, I had left out all the backstory, so the backstory was contained in that. So it was appropriate that it was fictional, because the song was fictional too.
Right.
Such a gentleman too. I love the way you say we gave everything to each other. I mean, there's so many times when I felt like, there's really not in a creepy way, but
not.
there's a couple of times when you could have said something else.
I heard the phrase "first gentleman." I never thought of it. Well, if
is that what they're gonna?
If Mrs. Clinton becomes the president, we will not have a first man, because that sounds ridiculous. That would be like you would have a sort of picture of the sort of creature in the Natural History Museum. But so it has to be the first gentleman. I thought I'd like that if I were married to the woman running for president.
It's a bit biblical, though. I don't know.
First gentleman.
Yeah.
I
don't think they would have liked that in the early days of the Republic, with royal allergy to royalty.
That's why you had a revolution to get rid of.
Yeah, right. Just a couple more, and Mary-Louise, you may have answered this in some way before, but these were given to me from the audience, so I just want to honor them. In writing your memoir in letter style, did you study other memoirs as a model? Did you try another style first, they asked?
No.
In a word.
Can I just say, I did sit for 10 years deciding whether I was going to have pistachio or tutti frutti. I did actually do that. My publisher will attest to the fact that I did. Literally, I wrote the book a couple of times before I was satisfied. You know, like good portions of it. So, I think you did well to choose on a form that was so sustaining that you finished.
It was a while to choose, but then writing it was about 4 months or something. But it was just the choosing was like.
The choosing is the hard part.
Okay, last one. This is for Elvis. You're such a musical omnivore, says the audience member, and your influences are so various. What new music do you listen to or recommend? A musical takeaway.
I don't know. It seems whatever the theme song is of the news, you know, they have that music that they play. That's very compelling. I find that it's about like my every waking moment. I don't know. I never like to name. Who would need the burden of me saying that I like their record? Really, honestly, I think they would then have to answer questions about that. I like a lot of people, but I'm not going to say their names. They know who they are.
These are both, in their very different ways, extraordinary and generous books, and totally worth your while, no matter what Elvis says about spending the time to read his. It's worth it.
It's really
they're well worth your while. Thank you, everyone, for coming out tonight. Thank you, Mary and Elvis.